Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. Published by Hansard, UK Parliament. Volume 759. Debated on Monday, 6 January 2025. Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I call the Home Secretary to make the statement on child sexual exploitation and abuse, I have a statement to make on behalf of Mr. Speaker. I remind members of the House's sub judice resolution, which prohibits reference being made to any active criminal cases. Members should therefore not make any reference to any active case in which an individual has already been charged. The Secretary of State for the Home Department. Child sexual abuse and exploitation are the most vile and horrific of crimes, involving rape, violence, coercive control, intimidation, manipulation, and deep long-term harm. The information from the crime survey should be chilling to all of us. It estimates that 500,000 children every year experience some form of child sexual abuse, violence and sexual violation in the home, repeated rapes or exploitation by grooming or pedophile gangs, threats and intimidation involving intimate images online, or abuse within institutions that should have protected and cared for young people, cruel and sadistic crimes against those who are most vulnerable. All of us have a responsibility to protect our children. Perpetrators must be punished and pursued, and victims and survivors must be protected and supported. But these crimes have not been taken seriously for too long, and far too many children have been failed. That is why this government are determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, and supporting stronger police action and protection for victims. There is no excuse for anyone not to take these crimes seriously. Brave survivors speaking out have shown a light on terrible crimes and the failure of institutions to act, be it in care homes in Rochdale, Asian grooming gangs in Rotherham or Telford, the abuse covered up within faith institutions, including the Church of England and the Catholic Church, or within family homes. That report, alongside the coming to light of other appalling crimes, is why our party, when in opposition, called for a national independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and supported that work when it was launched by the previous government. Over 7 years, that inquiry, expertly led by Professor Alexis J., engaged with more than 7,000 victims and survivors, processed 2 million pages of evidence, and published 61 reports and publications. The findings should be truly disturbing for everyone. They describe the pain and suffering caused to victims and survivors, and the deviousness and cruelty and perpetrators. Nor is there any excuse for anyone not to recognize and act on the deep harm and damage of organized gang exploitation, abuse, sexual assaults, and rape. 10 years ago, 2 reports by Alexis J. and Louise Casey in Rotherham found that 1,400 children had been sexually exploited, raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked across other towns, abducted, beaten, and threatened with guns. Children had even been doused in petrol. Girls as young as 11 had been raped. Those reports a decade ago identified a failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs and a widespread perception that they should downplay the ethnic dimensions for fear of being seen to be racist. When those reports came out, those failings in Rotherham were condemned across the board by both government and opposition in this House. As I said at the time, it is never an excuse to use race and ethnicity or community relations as an excuse not to investigate and punish sex offenders. Official Report, 2 September 2014. Volume 585, circa 169. The then Home Secretary made it clear that cultural concerns, the fear of being seen as racist, must never stand in the way of child protection. Official Report, 2 September 2014. Volume 585, circa 168. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse also ran a specific investigation strand into child sexual exploitation by organized networks, which ran for 2 years and produced a separate report in February 2022. It concluded that police forces and local councils were still failing to tackle this serious crime and set out further recommendations for change. But despite those different inquiries drawing up multiple recommendations, far too little has actually been done. None of the 20 recommendations from the independent inquiry into child abuse has been implemented. As the Act on IICSA campaign group from the Survivors Trust said this week, victims of child sexual abuse cannot afford further delays in meaningful action. It is imperative to keep the focus on radical reform. Two different conservative Home Secretaries said after the report was published that it was a watershed and should be the beginning of a new chapter for change, but that has not happened. We now need new impetus and action. Since coming into office, the safeguarding minister has met with Professor Alexis J. and survivors, and has convened the first dedicated cross-government group to drive forward change. To ensure that victims' voices remain at the very heart of this process, we will set up a new Victims and Survivors panel to work on an ongoing basis with the interministerial group, to guide them on the design, delivery and implementation of new proposals and plans not just on IICSA but on wider work around child sexual exploitation and abuse. We will set out more details and timescales based on that work. Before that, I can announce action on 3 key recommendations. First, I can confirm that we will make it mandatory to report abuse, and we will put measures in the Crime and Policing Bill, to be put before Parliament this spring, to make it an offense, with professional and criminal sanctions, to fail to report or to cover up child sexual abuse. The protection of institutions must never be put before the protection of children. I first called for this measure in response to the reports and failings in Rotherham 10 years ago. The Prime Minister first called for it 12 years ago, based on his experience as Director of Public Prosecutions. The case was clear then, but we have lost a decade and we need to get on with it now. Secondly, we will legislate to make grooming an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offenses, because the punishment must fit the terrible crime. Thirdly, we will overhaul the information and evidence that are gathered on child sexual abuse and exploitation and embed them in a clear new performance framework for policing, so that these crimes are taken far more seriously. One of the first recommendations of the independent inquiry was a single core data set on child abuse and protection, but that has never been done. We will introduce a single child identifier in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, and a much stronger police performance framework, including new standards on public protection, child abuse and exploitation. We are accelerating the work of the Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force, set up, rightly, under the previous government. There was a 25% increase in arrests between July and September last year. That sits alongside the Tackling Organized Exploitation program, which uses advanced data and analytics to uncover complex networks. Data on ethnicity is now being published, but we will work further with them to improve the accuracy and robustness of the data and analysis. We will continue to support further investigations that are needed, including police investigations and local independent inquiries and reviews, which can expose failings and wrongdoing in local areas and institutions, as we have seen in Telford, Rotherham and Greater Manchester. We support the ongoing work commissioned by Mayor Andy Burnham into historic abuse in Oldham, which has led to new police investigations, arrests and convictions. To build on those findings, the leader of Oldham Council has confirmed this week that work to set up a further local independent inquiry is already underway, including liaison with Oldham survivors. We welcome and support this work, which will put victims' voices at its heart. The Telford inquiry was particularly effective because victims were involved in shaping it at every stage. Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has now agreed to work with the government and other local councils where stronger engagement with victims and survivors is needed, or where more formal inquiries are required to tackle persistent problems. We should also be clear that wherever there have been failings or perpetrators of terrible crimes have not been brought to justice, the most important inquiries and investigations should be police investigations to track those perpetrators down, to bring them before the courts and to get victims the protection that they deserve. Finally, we have to face the serious challenge that the fastest growing area of grooming and child abuse is online. We will also take much stronger action to crack down on rapidly evolving forms of child sexual exploitation and abuse and grooming online, including tackling the exponential rise in artificial intelligence-facilitated child sexual abuse material. We will set out a significant package of measures to strengthen the law in this area in the coming weeks. For many years there has been broad cross-party consensus not only on the importance of this work, but that the interests of victims and survivors must come first. There will be different views about the details of the policies that are needed, but every one of us across this house has supported action to protect our children. It is the responsibility of us all to keep them safe for the future. I hope that members across the House will work with ministers and the Victims and Survivors panel that we are setting up to change protection for the better and to make sure that it is perpetrators who pay the price. I commend this statement to the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, I call the Shadow Home Secretary. Chris Philp. I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. The whole country is shocked by the rape gang scandal. Over years or decades, thousands or maybe tens of thousands of vulnerable young girls were systematically raped by organized gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Instead of those victims being protected and the perpetrators prosecuted, those girls were systematically failed. Many cases were covered up because of absurd concerns about so-called community relations. Often, the police did not investigate. Local councils covered things up. The Crown Prosecution Service frequently failed victims. Those raising concerns were frequently accused of racism. Never again can people be silenced in that way. I pay tribute to people who have raised these cases over the years, starting with former Labour MP Ann Cryer, who first raised these problems nearly 2 decades ago and bravely persevered despite accusations of racism and worse, including from her own colleagues. In that vein, let me say a word on the Prime Minister's comments this morning. It is not far right to stand up for victims of mass rape. Interruption. Madam Deputy Speaker. Order. People want to hear the response to the statement. Chris Philp. Smearing people who raise those issues is exactly how this got covered up in the first place. I repeat what I said yesterday. Intimidation and threats towards elected members of Parliament and ministers, including the Hun. Member for Birmingham Yardley, Jess Phillips, are completely wrong. As the Home Secretary said, action is important. The last government took extensive action, starting with the original J report commissioned in 2014 by the then Home Secretary, now Baroness May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and Sajid Javid commissioned data collection in 2018. On the response to the IICSA report published in 2022, it is not true that the last government took no action. The last government established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, whose work led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year and safeguarded 4,500 victims. My first question to the Home Secretary is therefore this. Will she confirm for the House? I am sure she can, that the Grooming Gangs Task Force's work will continue and, I hope, be stepped up. Secondly, as part of the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force, and, again, implementing one of the recommendations of the IICSA report, in April 2023 the last government mandated data collection on ethnicity, as the Home Secretary referred to. It has been going for over a year and a half, so will she confirm that the data on the ethnicity of perpetrators will be published? As the Home Secretary has acknowledged, one of IICSA's main recommendations was mandatory reporting to the police by people in positions of responsibility. The last government were in the process of implementing that recommendation, via a measure in the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell because of the early election. I am glad that she has announced that she will continue with the last government's proposals in her forthcoming bill. She can be assured that the opposition will support the government in the continuation of that measure. Finally, the Home Secretary did not address the need for a full national public inquiry into this scandal. While the previous government did initiate IICSA, under Professor J, that was mainly directed at other child sexual abuse and exploitation issues, and it covered only 6 of the towns involved in the gang rape scandal, it did not cover everything. We need to get to the truth. We have new evidence that is of interest to the public, including what Simon Danchik, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, said about the way that he was pressured into staying silent. We also have evidence of local authorities covering this up, and the third report, from last year, on Operation Span, commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, which exposes extremely serious failings by the Crown Prosecution Service. All that needs to be looked into. Will the Home Secretary therefore commission a national statutory public inquiry, which can compel witnesses to attend, requisition evidence and take evidence under oath? If the government will not order that inquiry, the opposition will table an amendment to the Children's Well-Being in Schools Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote. I hope that members across the House will vote for that full statutory public inquiry, so that we can get to the truth. Yvette Cooper. This is an issue on which I worked with government ministers when I was Shadow Home Secretary and when I was chair of the Home Affairs Committee, and there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these serious and vile crimes. These are the most appalling crimes against children, repeated multiple brutal rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling circumstances, and the abuse of children's trust, often by people who should have protected and looked after them. Institutions failed to keep them safe. That is why the independent inquiry was so important, why I and many others across this House called for it, and why we supported it when the previous government set it up. However, there has just not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There has not been enough change to policies, and to the way that services operate at a local level. It is a deep failing that those changes have not taken place. The Shadow Home Secretary used the example of the duty to report, which is incredibly important. It is about preventing any chance of people, including professionals, turning a blind eye to abuse, and covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It is about making that a criminal offense. We called for that 10 years ago. His party had a decade to introduce that. A decade that we have lost. A decade without those powers and measures in place. The Hun gentleman talks, rightly, about the task force, which I mentioned. We have supported not just continuing with that task force, but accelerating its work. The number of arrests in the most recent quarter increased significantly on the previous quarter. What I want to see most of all is perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for these vile crimes against children. In order to achieve that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country, so we will accelerate the work of the task force. The Hun gentleman refers to the ethnicity data, which was published in November. The latest report was published in November as a result of the task force's work. However, I do not think the data that has been gathered is adequate. It does not go far enough. There is a real problem with the way that police forces collect data, which is very haphazard. There is not a proper system for collecting data, or a proper performance framework for policing. To be honest, I think that his government withdrew too far from policing, and from having the kind of standards that we need to have in place. I hope that we can work together on a stronger performance framework, and a clearer framework for data, including for dealing with issues around ethnicity. Back in 2015, we had consensus on the need to ensure that race and ethnicity were never used as an excuse not to tackle crime, and that where vulnerable girls supposedly consented, when they in fact did not, that would not be used as an excuse not to tackle crime. We can never accept those excuses. I hope that we will agree on how we do that. On inquiries, the Shadow Home Secretary's party launched the child abuse inquiry. It set the terms of reference and provided the substantial funding for it. He could have raised concerns about the inquiry's terms of reference and scope, and the extent of its reports, at any point, including after it reported, but he did not do so until last week. I hope that the Hun gentleman will support the work that Oldham is determined to take forward, hopefully replicating the important Telford inquiry. I hope, too, that he is prepared to work with the Victims and Survivors panel, which will help us to take forward the further investigations, reviews and inquiries that should take place, both locally and across the country, in order to protect child victims. Madam Deputy Speaker, I call the chair of the Work and Pensions Committee, Debbie Abrahams. I welcome my right Hun friend's statement. Child sexual exploitation and abuse is a heinous crime. It happens everywhere, in all communities and in all settings, and we must all be vigilant and do what we can to address it. My right Hun friend mentioned the importance of ensuring that victims of CSE are at the heart of all that we do, and I support her wholeheartedly on that. If it is the will of the victims of the abuse in Oldham to have an additional review of the circumstances that led to their abuse, I will also wholeheartedly support that. Will my right Hun friend expand on how we can transparently track progress in implementing the recommendations? It cannot be allowed that 3 years after we received detailed recommendations from a national independent inquiry, we are still waiting for their implementation. Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend has worked immensely hard to champion the victims and survivors of terrible crimes. She raises important points about the prevalence of these appalling crimes, the need to be vigilant, wherever this abuse is to be found, in any kind of institution, across communities and across the country, and the importance of tracking progress. The Telford inquiry was set up in such a way that Tom Crowther, who led the inquiry, goes back each year to do a follow-up report and to track progress, which has been really important. We have encouraged those looking at this matter in Oldham to be in touch with those involved in Telford, And I am glad that Tom Crowther has agreed to work with the government on how we can make this work more widely. Madam Deputy Speaker, I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Lisa Smart. I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. No child should ever have to face sexual exploitation or abuse. There should simply be no place for this horrific, abhorrent behavior in our society. We must keep every child and young person impacted by these terrible, sickening crimes in our thoughts today. We owe it to the survivors to ensure that justice is delivered, which means requiring perpetrators to face the full force of the law, but also ensuring that the right steps are taken to stop children facing this vile abuse in the future. The expansive independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which published its report in 2022, set out how to do just that. However, under the previous conservative government, progress on implementing IICSA's recommendations stalled. Professor Alexis J., the chair of the inquiry, said that she was frustrated by the then government's lack of action. Will the Home Secretary say when we can expect a clear timeline for the full implementation of IICSA's recommendations, which Professor J has urged? Of course, that work cannot be siloed in the Home Office, so I would welcome more details about how cross-government work to implement the recommendations will be coordinated. Victims and survivors deserve more than warm words, they deserve action. It is my sincere hope that we can work together across this House to make that a reality, and can resist turning far too many children's suffering into a political football. Yvette Cooper. I welcome the points that the Hun member makes. Historically, there has been a lot of consensus across the House about the importance of this work, but often there has been very slow progress. We have to change that. She rightly says that this is not just a matter for the Home Office, or even police forces, local councils and social services. This must be about work across government and across communities. That is why the Safeguarding Minister, my Hun friend the member for Birmingham Yardley, Jess Phillips, is leading a cross-departmental program of work responding not just to the IICSA recommendations, but to broader work. Some of the work around online abuse is moving extremely fast, and we need action there as well. It is important that we set up the Victims and Survivors panel to work with this group. The victims and survivors need to be at the heart of implementation, so that they do not feel that after they gave evidence to the inquiry, that was it, nobody ever listened again. Madam Deputy Speaker, I call the Education Committee Chair, Helen Hayes. Helen Hayes. Several years ago, I supported, over a number of months, a constituent of mine who suffered horrific sexual abuse as a child in the care of Lambeth Council, as she prepared to give evidence to the independent inquiry on child sexual abuse, chaired by Professor J. It was unimaginably hard for victims and survivors to give evidence to that inquiry, reliving the abuse that they suffered and being re-traumatized. The fact that they did so was exceptionally important, and I pay tribute to their courage. My constituent and thousands of other victims and survivors gave their evidence so that their experiences could be at the heart of Professor J's recommendations. Does the Home Secretary agree that if we are really to put victims and survivors first, the priority must be to act on what they have already told us, and to implement the IICSA recommendations at pace, and in full? Yvette Cooper. I join my Hun friend in paying tribute to her constituent, and to the more than 7,000 victims and survivors who gave evidence to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and exploitation. The inquiry took 7 years, many years of people bravely speaking out about some of the most difficult and traumatic things imaginable, which none of us would ever want anybody to have to go through. She is also right that they must not feel that their evidence was just empty words that got lost in the air, even though an inquiry took place. We have to make sure that there is action. Some of that action may be difficult, and some may require very hard work, but we have to make sure that we take it forward and make progress to protect children for the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, I call Select Committee Member Robbie Moore. Robbie Moore. Rape gangs and the grooming of children has haunted Keighley in the wider Bradford district for decades, yet local leaders have consistently refused to launch an inquiry. The National IICSA report, which the Home Secretary is treating as a silver bullet, was not an inquiry into rape gangs. Nor does it reference Keighley or Bradford once, despite many, including me, fearing that the scale of this issue across the Bradford district will dwarf the scale of the issue in Rotherham. If the Home Secretary believes that the IICSA report gives us all the information that we need to tackle this vile and disgusting crime, can she tell me how many children across the Bradford district have been abused through child sexual exploitation? Who are the perpetrators, and when can my constituents expect to see them behind bars or deported? Yvette Cooper. Appalling crimes have taken place against children in Bradford, Keighley, and across the country. Truly appalling crimes. All of us have to face up to the fact that child sexual abuse and exploitation continues. This is not just about historical crimes, but continuing crimes and abuse of hundreds of thousands of children across the country. That is why it is so important, first of all, that we take forward the proposed reforms, and that we ensure a way to keep victims and survivors at their very heart. Some of that must be about how we change the way that police and councils work together to implement reforms, including on the duty to report. The Hun gentleman raises local concerns. We will work with Tom Crowther and the Victims and Survivors panel on how areas can best involve survivors and victims in what has happened in their area and ensure that they are properly listened to, so as to get to the truth and make fundamental changes. Paul Waugh. In the last few days, my hometown's name, Rochdale, has been exploited by some people who treat child rape as a political game rather than as an appalling crime that should be dealt with. The horrific abuse of children by grooming gangs, many of them predominantly Pakistani heritage grooming gangs, was compounded by failures by my local council and the local police. All Rochdalians, whatever their background, want to see sex offenders prosecuted swiftly and punished harshly. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement and ask her to leave no stone unturned in implementing all the recommendations of the J report, something the opposition signally failed to do. Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend is right to recognize the seriousness of these crimes. The experiences in Rochdale include not just the issues around the Pakistani heritage gang networks that he talks about, but issues in care homes and others that have been investigated over the years, and the terrible experiences of victims and survivors and their families as a result. My Hun friend is also right to say that we need change. That has to be about how we work with victims and survivors in taking forward new reforms and changes, and how we will have to go further in a series of areas. The thing about child abuse and exploitation is that perpetrators change all the time and look for new ways to abuse children. That is what we have to keep tackling. Nick Timothy. One of the most shocking details in respect of the rape gangs is the evidence of collusion and corruption among police officers, social workers, and local counselors. Will the Home Secretary commit today to establishing a unit in the National Crime Agency dedicated to investigating not only untried perpetrators but the police officers, social workers, and local counselors who were complicit in these disgusting crimes? Yvette Cooper. The Hun member makes an important point. Alongside pursuing perpetrators, which must always be the greatest priority because it is about protecting victims and ensuring that those who commit vile crimes face justice, there must be a responsibility on people for their public roles, whether in policing, local councils, or other institutions. We have seen issues around the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and other institutions that were investigated as part of the inquiry. One reason why we are so keen to change the law, indeed, it is something I raised back when the Hun member was working in the Home Office, is the importance of the duty to report. That then makes it an offense for public officials to cover up or fail to report. It is so important that we do that so that we can have proper accountability as well. Nadia Whittam. I sincerely commend the Home Secretary's statement. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse was extremely comprehensive. Over the course of 7 years, it examined 2 million pages of evidence and heard from over 7,000 survivors, every single one of whom we should pay tribute to today. They relived the most horrific trauma, only for the previous government to drag their heels in implementing the report's recommendations. Calls for a fresh inquiry from the Conservatives and reform are a shameful attempt to stoke division at the expense of victims, survivors, and children. I thank the Home Secretary for refusing to give in to that deeply harmful and offensive political point scoring. Will she set out a timeline for when she expects to have fully implemented the IICSA recommendations? Yvette Cooper. The clear point is, as my Hun friend says, that victims and survivors need to be at the heart of the work to take forward the implementation of reforms and changes, and we want to work with the new Victims and Survivors panel to draw up timelines. I recognize that some of the issues around reform are difficult and that we need extensive work with victims and survivors on how they can be dealt with, but there are other areas in which we can move really swiftly, such as changing the law on the duty to report, overhauling the way in which we collect information and data, and putting in place proper monitoring systems in local areas in respect of child sexual exploitation and abuse. I hope we can build a sense of consensus on our objective, which is to protect children. That is what this should all be about, and I hope that everyone will sign up to it. Josh Baberand. Considerable evidence tells us that children exposed to domestic violence are at increased risk of abuse themselves. Growing up, I was one of those children, and as a survivor I am appalled to have seen the shadow Home Secretary weaponize this issue in the way we saw earlier. I am appalled to see the likes of reform play this issue like a political football, and I am appalled that 0 of the 20 recommendations in Professor Jay's report have been implemented so far. In the light of the link between domestic abuse and child abuse, I have tabled a bill to create a dedicated set of domestic abuse offenses in the law for the first time. Will the Home Secretary meet me to discuss the bill's provisions and how we can better respect and protect survivors across the country? Yvette Cooper. I thank the HUN member for speaking out about his personal experiences. I realize that is never an easy thing to do, and I respect him for doing it. As he says, there are all kinds of links, and domestic abuse in the household has an incredibly damaging impact on the family and on children growing up. We have to see the work on the protection of children as part of the wider work on public protection, and as being strongly linked to our mission to halve the incidence of violence against women and girls over the next 10 years. The Safeguarding Minister will be keen to discuss with the HUN member his proposals relating to domestic abuse and how we can work together on these issues. Madam Deputy Speaker. Order. The level of interest shows how important this issue is, but I will struggle to get everybody in unless members keep their questions short and the answers are just as short. I call Chris Murray, who is a member of the Select Committee. Chris Murray. The focus of this debate should not be on the politics, on what is in the newspapers or on what is on social media. It should be on the children themselves. For 4 years before coming to the House, I worked on preventing trafficking, especially the trafficking of child victims around the country for sex. The stories that I heard would chill your bones, especially the stories of those who sought protection from the authorities but ended up back in the hands of their traffickers. There is so much more that we could do for those children. I know that not just from my own experience but because it is there in black and white, in the findings of the inquiries. We have 2 million pages of evidence and 700 witnesses, and 0 recommendations have been implemented. Will the Home Secretary commit to putting safeguarding first rather than putting politics first, as people are so transparently trying to do, and implement the findings as quickly as possible? Yvette Cooper. I welcome the work my HUN friend has done in this policy area. He is right to talk about young people and children being trafficked around the country. There is some concerning evidence that, for example, although work has been done to identify people being trafficked through county lines, often boys and young men, it has not sufficiently identified the young women and teenage girls who are being trafficked around for sexual exploitation. We need to ensure that improvements are made in that regard. Lee Anderson. The labor lot over there are banging on about playing politics with this important issue, but the last time I attended a debate on child rape gangs only one labor backbencher turned up. They should hang their heads in shame. Does the Home Secretary agree that we need a specific inquiry into why young British white girls are being systematically raped by men of Pakistani heritage? Yvette Cooper. We need to make sure that young people and children are being protected. These are vile crimes against children. Across the country we have seen young girls, teenagers and young boys who have been exploited by perpetrators in the most cruel and horrendous way. We have seen abuse by Pakistani heritage gangs. We have seen pedophile gangs operating online. We have seen abuse in communities and institutions and family homes, and all those crimes are truly horrendous. After the Rotherham inquiry in 2014, when we saw appalling abuse by, in that case, a Pakistani heritage gang, I called for a duty to report. I called for the law to be changed to place a responsibility on public servants to report child abuse, and to make it an offense to cover it up. The government of whom the HUN gentleman was a part for many years failed to bring in that duty to report, and we have lost a decade. We have to change the law. We have to make sure that we go after abuse without fear or favor, wherever it is found, in order to secure justice and protection for victims, and that dangerous perpetrators end up behind bars. Anna Dixon. I associate myself with the Home Secretary's remarks condemning those who perpetrate these horrific crimes. I stand with all victims of child sexual exploitation and sexual violence. As the Hun member for Keighley and Ilkley, Robbie Moore, knows, there was an independent review of child sexual exploitation in Bradford, which reported in 2021. A cross-party committee there has overseen the local changes, and I commend the actions of West Yorkshire Police in locking up more than 20 perpetrators since 2021. Does my right Hun friend agree that the failure of the previous government to take action on the J report is a disgrace? What further actions by police and local authorities are needed to tackle these pernicious crimes? Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend has rightly referred to the work done by West Yorkshire Police not only to look at public protection currently but to pursue historic investigations, which continue to be important because people often feel unable to come forward and tell their story about the abuse that has taken place until many years later. When survivors are brave enough to come forward, it is incredibly important for their stories to be investigated fully, and for operations like those run by West Yorkshire Police into historic abuse to continue. We owe it to victims and survivors to make sure that change happens in practice, and that includes changing the law as part of the Policing End Crime Bill. Simon Hoare. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. It is important to remember that these terrible crimes could happen to anyone and could be perpetrated by anyone, irrespective of color, class, heritage, or geography. I think the Home Secretary is right that the public want to see action now. Frankly, I remain unconvinced that a new public inquiry will throw any new light or information on this issue. The best place for victims to have their stories told is in court, when the perpetrators are brought to justice. May I ask the Home Secretary to make it clear to the world of local government and policing that the implementation of rules and regulations is color and class blind? Too many of these victims were simply dismissed as, to use that media phrase, white trash. They were poor, in many instances not particularly well educated, often in trouble with the authorities, and too easily dismissed. That is where the failure really took place. They were dismissed for who they were. That can never happen again. Yvette Cooper. I welcome the Hun member's really important point about the response having to be colorblind and class blind. It has to see these things for what they are, really terrible crimes, often against the most vulnerable young people, as he says. Young people were dismissed because they were vulnerable due to the difficult experiences that they might have had. Young girls were often not taken seriously, and myths operated in the way that services responded. A lot of work has been done to challenge those myths, but the reality is that unless we have a proper, strong performance management framework in place, and strong requirements on local organizations and agencies to respond and to take this issue seriously enough, the risk is that it just becomes lost in a corner, as opposed to being treated as the very serious crime that it is. That is why we want to embed this as part of a proper performance framework for policing, and to work with local councils too. Joe White. Professor J heard from my constituent Terry Lodge, who was fostered and lived a life of slavery, with no education and no childhood. He has suffered the consequences throughout his life. Nottinghamshire County Council accepted all liability for its failings. To its shame, the council is still to make an offer of compensation. Does the Home Secretary agree that although J's recommendations must be implemented in full, Nottinghamshire County Council must also step up and do the right thing? Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend makes a really important point about the responsibility of local councils to recognize the things that have gone wrong in the past, to recognize the responsibilities that they owe to local victims and survivors, and to provide the support that those victims and survivors need. I know that my Hun friend, the safeguarding minister, will keep in touch with her about progress, but it is really important that all councils make sure that they recognize their responsibilities. Shaukat Adam. Perpetrators of sexual crimes must face the full force of the law, regardless of their race, their religion, or their nationality. But an overseas bad faith actor is using truly horrific cases of group-based child rape to demonize a community and slander a minister of the Crown, someone who has genuine experience of helping victims of abuse. This narrative is false, and it is dangerous. Many reports from 2015 to 2024 have concluded that the common denominator for sexual violence is not immigration, race, or culture. The real point here is that if victims are being falsely told that perpetrators look a certain way or are part of a certain community, they will have a false sense of security when they are with people who do not fit that stereotype. The real issue here is that we need the discussion to be focused on victims, not political rhetoric, and we need evidence-based policies. Yvette Cooper. One of the points that the independent inquiry made was about the broad nature of this abuse and the way in which it can be found anywhere. When we have 500,000 children being subjected to child sexual abuse or exploitation every year, there is an impact right across the country. It means that we have serious problems and failings within all kinds of different institutions, as the inquiry found. It looked into issues within local councils, care homes, faith organizations including the Church of England, and different grooming and exploitation groups. Wherever such abuse is found, we have to treat it as a terrible crime against children. No excuses. No excuses can be made for perpetrators, and no excuses can be made for inaction. There has to be strong action to go after the perpetrators, whoever and wherever they are, and protection for the victims, whoever and wherever they are. Oliver Ryan. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. Under this government, no matter an abuser's race and where they are, they will have nowhere to hide. The job in hand is action, implementation, and change. I am glad to hear that she will set up a new victims panel, because the victims of sexual abuse, women and children, are usually forgotten in the wild whirlwind of Twitter. I have to say that it is usually men using this issue to grind a political axe. Does she agree that it is not a bandwagon to jump on for anybody's political TV talk show? This is a serious issue. Victims deserve to lead the process, and I am sure she will enable that. Yvette Cooper. These are really serious crimes. For someone like Alexis J., who worked in this area over very many years before she led the independent inquiry, and for others who have been working in this area over very many years, it has to be about the victims and survivors, but it also has to be about getting serious about delivering change and making sure that change happens in practice. Therefore, it has to be about how we make sure that there are proper monitoring processes to follow up change, rather than just thinking, well, an announcement has been made, but nothing changes and nothing is actually done. Far more important than the debates taking place on social media is the practical plan for delivering change. Wendy Morden. The government have been very keen to set up 60 reviews since coming into office, including one on social care, but they have refused a formal request from Oldham Council for a national statutory inquiry into child sexual abuse, grooming and gang rape. Why not let sunlight, transparency and justice into the process? Yvette Cooper. I say to the right Hun. Lady that, as I made clear in my statement, we support the independent review that Oldham Council is planning to set up. We have also suggested that it work with those who were involved in the Telford inquiry, which was extremely effective. Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has agreed to that. Interestingly, one of those who gave evidence to both the Telford inquiry and the national inquiry has described how she found it much easier to give evidence to the Telford inquiry and thought it was more effective at getting to the nitty-gritty of what had gone wrong in Telford. I suspect that that is why the previous government, of which the right Hun lady was a part, said repeatedly to Oldham Council that it should pursue the local inquiry. We want to make sure that there are proper investigations, inquiries and reviews wherever there is evidence that needs to be pursued. Most importantly of all, there have to be police investigations to get justice. Mr. Clive Betts. In 2014-15, the then Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee did a report on CSE in Rotherham. That report drew heavily on the evidence from Alexis J's first report, which was on the problems in Rotherham, the failings of the police, the failings of the council and the failings of Ofsted. What that surely shows is that a local authority commissioned inquiry, which is what Alexis J's first inquiry was, can get to the bottom of these problems, expose the failings and lead to improvements at local level. Surely Oldham Council can do exactly the same. Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend is right, because that is the work that Oldham Council is now taking forward. We want to work with Oldham Council and to be able to support it, and we wanted to be able to see the work that was done in Telford, which was effective at delivering change. Tom Crowther goes back to see the work in Telford to make sure that progress is being made. That is crucial, because it is no good just having inquiries that do not actually lead to any change or anything different happening. There has to be detailed work, be it at local level or at national level, but there also has to be follow through. Liz Saville Roberts. The Labour Welsh Government are responsible for child safeguarding in Wales, and the Home Secretary said that none of the independent inquiry's 20 recommendations was implemented by the previous Tory government. 6 recommendations applied to Wales, but no new actions were taken there either. Given that her statement rightly puts victims and survivors first, will she tell me how victims and survivors in Wales will now be able to demand a culture of real change? Yvette Cooper. Many issues obviously cut across, including issues around policing that apply to England and Wales. For example, the police performance framework that we are talking about, and some of the data issues that we are talking about. So we need to work with Welsh police forces and the Welsh government on taking the measures forward. They are immensely important, because part of the problem has been that there is no sense of what is actually being measured and what will actually change. What are the performance standards that we expect from all police forces right across the country? If those do not exist, too little changes in practice. A performance management framework has been missing from Wales, as well as from across England, and that is what we are determined to introduce. Harpreet Uppal. The horrific cases of CSE and rape across the country have exposed deep failures in the safeguarding of vulnerable children and, as members have said, there were unfortunately too many times when they were not treated as children by the agencies that should have supported them. I welcome the steps that the Home Secretary has set out, but will she ensure that there is long-term funding to support survivors in rebuilding their lives, that their voices will lead on reform, and that we support local charities such as the Kirklees Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre and the Pennine Domestic Abuse Partnership in my constituency, which do fantastic work but have to fight for funding every year? Yvette Cooper. I thank my Hun friend for raising the local service. The Safeguarding Minister also is a strong supporter of the work that service is doing. My Hun friend is right about the importance of making sure that we support victims and survivors, and we need to work with the Victims and Survivors panel on how we take that forward. She is also right to say that part of the problem is that the children were not treated or respected as children. They were just treated as somehow being adults and not as being exploited and subjected to the most terrible of crimes. That is one of the fundamental things that has to change. Sir Bernard Jenkin. I also thank the Secretary of State for her statement. I think the House is overwhelmingly behind her in dealing with these difficult subjects and implementing the findings of the J report. However, I am listening carefully to these exchanges, and the arguments against a further public inquiry, in response to my Hun friend the member for Keighley and Ilkley, Robbie Moore, for example, seem rather thin. Oh, we have already got too much to do. Oh, it probably won't find out anything new. Oh, let the council do it on its own. I just wonder whether this is in fact a matter of public confidence. If the Home Secretary cannot restore public confidence without a further public inquiry, please will she not rule it out? Yvette Cooper. We obviously supported the independent inquiry into child abuse, including the 2-year investigation that it did into organized networks of child sexual exploitation. That was immensely important as well. We also continue to support the local inquiries, reviews and investigations, including in Oldham. I have particularly highlighted the work that was done in Telford, and there is a reason for that. The Telford inquiry was set up as a local independent inquiry, but it has proved more effective than many of the other pieces of work that have been undertaken in this area, through having victims and survivors at the heart of that local inquiry from the very beginning. They were involved not just in giving evidence but in drawing up and shaping the way that the whole inquiry went forward. It also has in place a proper framework for following up and making sure that, a year later, progress is being made and action is being taken. We want to learn from what worked effectively in Telford. Interestingly, that is different from what has happened in some other areas, so the way in which it has worked is significant. That is why we believe that the right next steps will be for Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, and the victims and survivors who were involved in Telford, to share that experience with other areas, including Oldham, so that we can make sure we have a proper framework for local areas and institutions to get to the truth about what has happened in their area and to ensure that changes take place. At the same time, we must recognize that we had the 2-year inquiry into child exploitation nationally as part of the overarching review, and that a series of recommendations from the overarching review have still not been acted on. So let us work with the Victims and Survivors panel that we are determined to set up on what is the best form for future investigations and work. Madam Deputy Speaker. Order. I am planning to run the statement only until 7 p.m., so it might be helpful if we had very short questions and perhaps shorter answers from the Home Secretary. Ms. Stella Creasy. May I just say, on behalf of every decent-minded MP across the House, how powerful and important it is to see the safeguarding minister here on the front bench with the Home Secretary. It is a testament to their commitment to getting this matter right and not being deflected, however hard other people try, from what really matters, which is the victims of these horrific crimes. I am proud to sit behind them and to support the work they are doing, and I welcome what they have said about bringing in a victims panel. In the spirit of the cross-party working that we will need to do on this, may I also welcome the words of the Hun. Member for North Dorset, Simon Hoare. He is right that the common story we hear time and again from victims of abuse, whether from grooming gangs, in care homes or in their own homes, is that they were not believed, nobody listened to them. How can we have the national conversation that we need to have about the culture of belief, putting victims first and finally ending the silence that has meant so many have been the victims of these perpetrators for so long? Yvette Cooper. My Hun friend is right. We have to ensure that victims' voices are heard and that they can have the confidence to come forward, because often they feel that they will not be believed and will not get the support they need if they do speak out. That can make it extremely difficult. I also support her words about the safeguarding minister, who not only does a phenomenal job in the Home Office now but has been a tireless champion for victims of abuse and exploitation for very many years. Without her, there is no doubt that the Home Office would not be making the progress we are now making on tackling these serious crimes. Neil O'Brien. Many victims of the grooming gangs still do not feel that justice has been done. It is very concerning that the two men leading the Greater Manchester inquiry resigned because they felt that they were being blocked from accessing the information they needed. The IICSA was an important start, but it was not, and was never meant to be, a detailed report into the grooming gangs. It looked at 6 places where the grooming gangs operated, but they operated in more than 40 places. The right Hun lady says that the answer is locally led inquiries, but we have had years for that to happen and it has not happened, or it has not happened properly. Indeed, in many cases the local authorities were part of the problem and we were asking them to mark their own homework. I totally agree with her about the importance of the J recommendations, but will she please rethink so that we can actually listen to the voices of those who, to this day, have never been listened to? Yvette Cooper. The whole point of us setting up a Victims and Survivors panel is to ensure that the voices of victims and survivors continue to be heard as part of the implementation, as part of the action and as part of the further investigations that need to take place. This cannot be a case of simply having a one-off inquiry and then everybody turns their back, moves on and talks about something different. We have to ensure that there is serious change. There was obviously a 2-year inquiry that looked at organized grooming gangs and child exploitation, but we have also had the issues around Telford. Telford was not included in detail as part of that inquiry, and there will be other areas where detailed questions are still unresolved. That is why we want Tom Crowther to be able to work with the government and with other areas on how best to ensure that victims and survivors feel that their voices will be heard, in the way that the Hun gentleman describes. He is right that too often they do not feel that, and that is often because, frankly, we still need further police investigations into those terrible crimes and the perpetrators who have still not been brought to justice. Emma Foodie. Anyone who has worked with survivors, as I have, knows how extraordinarily painful but important it was to have the IICSA inquiry and for survivors to be heard, to be believed and, crucially, to finally see action taken. I pay tribute to the thousands of survivors who participated in the inquiry. Survivors should not have to repeatedly relive their trauma in order to see action finally being taken, and they have told us that now is the time for action. I refer to the recent quotes from Alexis J., who described the inaction of the previous government as weak and apparently disingenuous with regard to what they did. Does the Home Secretary agree that the way to protect vulnerable children is to take action and implement the recommendations as quickly as possible? Yvette Cooper. We need to take forward the work on the inquiry, with victims and survivors, on a continuing basis. I would also highlight that there are some areas that will need to go well beyond the independent inquiry, such as the way in which online abuse and online grooming are accelerating. Gangs and organized networks are operating online and then drawing young people offline for physical abuse, as well as for sharing terrible images. That is a massive and growing crime, and I am really worried about it. We are going to need much stronger action. Whether it is through social media companies taking more responsibility or having stronger measures online, we will need more action. Richard Ford. Alexis J's independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has not been fully implemented. The inquiry recommended legislating to force tech firms to take stronger action on online abuse material. Since then, this House has passed the Online Safety Act 2023, and Ofcom set out its implementation plans last October. But how can the government ensure that tech companies take stronger action on online abuse? Yvette Cooper. The Hun. Gentleman is right to refer to the Online Safety Act, which took longer to come into force than I would have wished, but it is now being implemented. That means new measures will come into place in the spring, with further measures and requirements in the summer. We will also come forward with further measures on online exploitation and abuse, and we will set them out in due course. Melanie ONN. I warmly welcome the Home Secretary's statement, and I look forward to the timeline she will present for implementing the recommendations. In her statement, she mentioned support and belief for victims and survivors. One of the biggest supportive actions she could take is to consider preventing CSE rapists from seeing their children born from these crimes, once they are convicted, as they use access to their children to continue their abuse and to re-victimize the girls whose lives they have already ruined once. Yvette Cooper. My Hun. Friend makes a really important point. This can be the most appalling way of continuing this abuse, as that is what it is, with abusers using the courts and other institutions effectively to continue their abuse and exploitation. We will be taking action in this area, and we will be putting forward more measures. Both the Safeguarding Minister and the Victims Minister, my Hun. Friend the member for Pontypridd, Alex Davies Jones, can have further discussions with her about that. Sir Gavin Williamson. In Telford we saw the systematic abuse of so many children who were raped, and we saw a cover-up by the police and council officials, yet not a single member of the police force or a single council official in Telford, or anywhere else in the country, has gone to jail. Will the Secretary of State use her power to set up a specialist unit within the National Crime Agency, as my Hun. Friend the member for West Suffolk, Nick Timothy, said, to look at this and ensure that some of those who covered up these crimes are held to account? Yvette Cooper. I do think there needs to be stronger action on accountability, so I think the right Hun. Gentleman makes a serious point about these issues across public services, but one of the most effective ways to do that is by strengthening the legal framework, including the legal requirements on those who are responsible, through having a duty to report and making it clear that blocking and covering up is an offense. Where there are existing powers, we must ensure that they are properly used and strengthened. I gently remind the right Hun. Gentleman that he was a minister, including an education minister, over many years when people were calling for a strengthening of the law. I hope he will now support that strengthening of the law, even though he did not at the time. Blair McDougall. I warmly welcome the measures that the Home Secretary has set out to pursue perpetrators and to challenge the culture of cover-up, and I also welcome her strong statement that nobody should resist the urge to report child rape for fear of being labeled a racist. Does she share my contempt for those who weaponize the suffering of victims, particularly through online disinformation, to pursue their own hateful agendas? The attacks by Elon Musk on the Safeguarding Minister in the last few days crossed a line for me, so I deactivated my X account earlier. At what point does the continued presence of government departments on that platform legitimize a space that is now not only poisonous but dangerous? Yvette Cooper. My Hun. Friend is right that this has to be about showing respect for victims and survivors. It cannot be about perpetuating misinformation online for the sake of clicks and audiences. We have a responsibility to make practical changes, and I hope we can stick to this House's core tradition of sitting opposite each other, across the dispatch boxes and across the chamber, to talk about what really matters to our constituents, rather than simply chasing headlines online. Sammy Wilson. I welcome the measures that the Home Secretary has announced today on mandatory reporting, on grooming being an aggravating factor, and on the better use of data, but the fact remains that there is still widespread suspicion that there has been a cover-up because of the nature of these crimes and those who perpetrated them. Does she agree that there is a need for a national inquiry because it has been seen that the problem is wider than was originally envisaged, because there has been a disgraceful cover-up by public bodies, and because there are allegations that the CPS had a role in ensuring that people were not prosecuted? Rather than hiding behind the rhetoric that this is a far-right demand, does she not accept that this would be a reasonable response from a government who say they want to deal with the problem and restore public confidence? Yvette Cooper. The very reason why I and many of us called for an independent inquiry many years ago was because of the deep concern about the scale of the hidden abuse and about the total failure of institutions to respond. There were concerns about information being hidden, and about authorities not taking the action that was needed. That is why we called for an inquiry in the first place, and it is why the previous government invested over £150 million in that inquiry over 7 years. The inquiry rightly included a 2-year investigation into the grooming gangs and organized child exploitation, but further work needs to be done in local areas. I have mentioned Telford, and Oldham is now taking forward that work as well. Ultimately, this all goes back to the need for police investigations. The police are the ones who have the powers to get to the truth about the perpetrators who are committing crime, to gather the evidence, to get them before a court and to get them behind bars. Emily Darlington. Over 500,000 children are sexually abused each year, and there are about as many perpetrators, yet some opposition members want to focus only on a few, rather than the big cases we have heard about involving TV presenters, the Catholic Church and others. This is something we have to take seriously, rather than exploiting it to chase headlines or look for future funders for political parties. We are taking action, led by 2 formidable women who will not let any abuser get away with exploiting women, men or children anywhere, particularly online. The Science, Innovation and Technology Committee will tomorrow begin an inquiry into algorithms. Can the Home Secretary reassure the House that action is the priority for this government, not further years of talking? Action is what survivors need. Yvette Cooper. My friend is right that we need action, and we need to see progress and change. Further areas will need investigations and inquiries. For example, I welcome the Select Committee inquiry she mentioned, particularly the investigation into online abuse and exploitation. As well as the expansion of online abuse, I am deeply concerned about the growing number of young people who are being drawn into abuse, and especially abuse between teenagers. That type of exploitation and harm of young people is extremely serious, and it is escalating. Madam Deputy Speaker. I call Dr. Caroline Johnson to ask the final question. Dr. Caroline Johnson. The House has agreed this afternoon that cultural sensitivities should not get in the way of police investigations. However, it would appear that they have and they perhaps still are, and that victims have been let down and that current victims might be being failed even today. There is a specific problem with gangs of organized men, who are systematically raping and abusing young children. Within that group, there is an overrepresentation of men of Pakistani heritage. We need to understand why, but piecemeal investigation, town by town, will not help us to do that, will not serve the interests of victims, by ensuring they get the justice they deserve, and will not prevent future cases. Yvette Cooper. The Hun lady rightly raises an important point that was first raised as part of the Jay inquiry, more than 10 years ago, and then by the Casey inquiry, and she is right that we need to see action. Despite those issues having been raised over a decade ago, in many areas, not just grooming gangs and exploitation, but other areas of child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse, there has still not been any action taken to change things, which is why we have to make sure that action is taken. We have to look at the recommendations made, including in the 2-year strand that was part of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and we have to work with the Victims and Survivors panel to identify further areas for investigation. We have to improve ethnicity data, which is not adequate. We published what we have in November, but it is not strong enough. That kind of data can inform the kinds of investigations that need to take place. We need to ensure that we look into child abuse wherever it is to be found across the country, in whatever institution or community. Crime is crime, and children need protecting, wherever they are.